Let's break it down straight from the hill to your hometown. No spin, no hype, just facts we find. AI's on the case, no truth left behind. Laws are written, deals are made. Who's got your back, who's throwing shade? We cut through the noise, decode the text, keeping it real. Congress in context, Congress in context, shining the light, breaking it down so you know what's right. Policies, votes, who's working for you? We bring the facts, the power is you.
Welcome back to Congress in Context. Learners, if you're ready to dive into the Congressional Record with us, well, you've come to the right place. Because today we're going to untangle the key happenings from a specific date in Congress, March 24th, 2025.
Yeah, peeling back the layers of this day in Congress, it's going to be like I think, a fascinating journey, really. We've got a mix of, tributes and recognitions, legislative action, a little bit of everything.
Yeah, it's a good mix of stuff, and it's going to give a really nice snapshot, I think, of what's going on in Congress at this time. So let's just jump right into it, starting with the House of Representatives.
Yeah, it's good.
One thing that really struck me when I was reading through the record was all the time that they spent on personal tributes and recognitions. It wasn't all just like hardcore legislative wrangling. They were recognizing people, and it just kind of stood out to me.
You're right, and that is something you see a lot in the Congressional Record. Members taking time to acknowledge achievements and, recognize losses in their communities. It really emphasizes the connection between a representative and the people they serve.
Absolutely. And so we had, examples like Mr. Joyce of Pennsylvania recognizing a Korean War veteran, Lloyd Peck, from his district.
Yeah, Mr. Peck was a real pillar of his community, it seems, not just for his service in Korea, but also for his continued dedication to fellow veterans through the American Legion.
Yeah, and it's a good reminder, right? Like, we often focus on these national figures, but, real impactful leadership happens at the local level, too, like we'd see with Mr. Peck and his work on behalf of veterans.
And that's the beauty of it, right? These seemingly local stories actually contribute to the larger American narrative. Like, Mr. Peck's service reflects a value we see across the country, and by recognizing him in the Congressional Record, it kind of makes those values part of the official record of our government,
Yeah, that makes sense. We also had a little bit of a lighter note with Mrs. Miller Meeks celebrating Stephen Buchanan's NCAA wrestling title. And this was, I think, especially notable because President Trump was actually in attendance.
Oh, wow. So this wasn't just any wrestling match, huh?
No, it was a big deal. And President Trump being there, that puts a spotlight on collegiate athletics on a national level even.
Right, right. It's not just sports anymore when you have a figure like the president there. It becomes this moment of national recognition and, pride showcasing American talent.
Yeah. Mrs. Miller Meeks also honored Glenn Keppy from her state of Iowa for his commitment to family and farming.
Yeah, Mr. Keppy sounds like the embodiment of those strong Iowa values.
Yeah, he seemed like a great guy. And it really got me thinking about, how important agriculture is to our country, not just economically, but, culturally, too.
Yeah, and these tributes often give us a glimpse into what different representatives value, right, and the different backgrounds of the people they represent. I mean, honoring someone like Mr. Keppy really emphasizes how crucial the agricultural sector remains.
Yeah, it really does. Moving down to Arkansas now, we had Mr. Hill recognizing Keaton DeGroot for his work in the community and in his future in banking. And he also celebrated the 100th birthday of John Edward Hayne Jr.
That's great, celebrating both emerging leaders like Mr. DeGroot and those who have really contributed over lifetime like Mr. Hayne. It's a nice balance,
Yeah, I thought so too. And then in Tennessee, Mr. Kustoff celebrated Coach Bubba Luckett's 40 years in high school basketball.
40 years, wow. Must have seen a lot of players come and go.
Yeah, and what stood out to me, they talked about the wins and everything, but they really focused on his mentorship and the impact that he's had on these young players' lives.
And that is a key part of these recognitions, right? It's recognizing that impact that goes beyond just whatever the field is, whether it's coaching or teaching or something else. Like with Coach Luckett, it sounds like he really shaped these young people's character.
Right. But then, the tone shifts a little bit with the recognition of Congressman Raul Grijalva of Arizona, who had recently passed away. And it sounded like his loss was really felt across the aisle.
Yeah, and it's in moments like these, when Congress pauses to remember one of their own, that you can see the human side of politics. Congressman Grijalva had a long career, right? A Chicano activist, a leader in the Progressive Caucus, a real force in policy debates.
Yeah, and Mr. Gosar from Arizona, who he spoke about how even though they disagreed on many things, they could still see eye to eye on certain issues, and he really recognized Mr. Grijalva's commitment to his constituents.
Yeah, and I think that's important for people to see, that even in this, sometimes very polarized environment, there's still that level of respect.
Yeah. So after those tributes, the House moved on to some legislative action, and the first bill up for discussion was H.R. 359, the Cost Share Accountability Act of 2025. And this one seemed to have quite a bit of bipartisan support.
Yeah, this bill was introduced by Mr. Obernolt, and it's all about transparency when it comes to how the Department of Energy, the DOE, handles those cost-sharing agreements for research and development awards. Basically, it would require the DOE to submit quarterly reports to Congress about any modifications or waivers granted for these cost-share requirements, and importantly, those reports would be made public.
So it's less about preventing the DOE from making adjustments and more about making sure that Congress and the public know why and when those changes are happening.
Exactly. And Mr. Babbitt and Ms. Stevens, they both spoke in support of the bill, really stressing the need for that kind of oversight.
Right. And it really raises this kind of fundamental question about, the role of Congress, right? How much control should they have over the taxpayer dollars that are allocated to these executive agencies?
Yeah, that's a tension you see a lot in governance, trying to strike that balance between giving agencies the flexibility they need to operate, but also maintaining accountability and making sure that, that taxpayer money is being spent responsibly.
Yeah. And then the conversation turned to a topic that's always a point of concern, right? Social Security. And a Democratic representative, they raised some serious concerns about the program's long-term solvency and the potential for benefit cuts down the road.
This is one of those debates that never really goes away. And the representative brought up some statistics, talking about how many people rely on Social Security, both in the Speaker's district and nationwide, and how those numbers are just going to keep growing as the baby boomers continue to retire.
Right. And they also pointed out that, many beneficiaries, especially women of color, are currently receiving benefits that are below the poverty line.
Yeah.
And that's really concerning.
Yeah, and the representative's argument was that Congress hasn't done enough to address this, and that instead of talking about cutting benefits, we should be looking at ways to strengthen the program and ensure its long-term sustainability. They specifically criticize the fact that higher earners, like billionaires, aren't contributing a proportionally larger share.
Right. And this definitely injected a strong partisan perspective into the day's proceedings.
Yeah.
We're starting to see some of those political divides emerge.
Yeah, and it's important for you, the learner, to understand that this debate is about more than just numbers, right? It's about the very idea of a safety net for American workers and about what we owe to retirees who have paid into the system their whole lives. The different viewpoints often come down to different philosophies about how best to ensure that the system is viable for the long term and about who should bear the responsibility for making that happen.
Absolutely. Next up, we have H.R. 730, the Mathematical and Statistical Modeling Education Act. And this one, kind of like the Cost Share Accountability Act, it seemed to have widespread support. And the focus here was on updating how we teach math in schools, which is, pretty interesting.
Yeah, and it's really about preparing students for the future, right? I mean, this is a bipartisan bill that's all about offering competitive grants to support teaching mathematical and statistical modeling, and not just in high school, but starting all the way back in elementary school. And, Chairman Baird and Representative Houlihan, they both spoke about how important these skills are becoming.
Right. And not just for STEM fields,
Right.
But also for our nation's ability to compete economically on a global scale and even for national security.
Yeah, they specifically mentioned China, which has been making huge investments in STEM education. And they talked about how we need to keep pace if we want to maintain our edge in the global economy.
Yeah. And there was also mention of a study by the national academies that's going to be done to identify the most effective methods for teaching these skills, which I thought was interesting because it shows that they're really committed to taking an evidence-based approach to improving education.
Right, exactly. I mean, it's not just about throwing money at the problem. It's about making sure those funds are being used effectively. And, we live in an increasingly data-driven world, right? So being able to understand and use mathematical and statistical models is really becoming a fundamental skill, no matter what field you're in. And this bill is a sign that both Democrats and Republicans recognize that and want to make sure that American students are equipped to succeed in the 21st century.
Yeah. Okay, so following that, the House took up H.R. 1318, the United States Research Protection Act. And this one was all about clarifying the definition of what constitutes a malign foreign talent recruitment program in the context of the GFPS and Science Act. So a very specific focus, but an important one.
It is, because it really gets at this issue of, protecting American intellectual property and research, especially from, well, foreign espionage. I mean, the U.S. has always been this, kind of leader in scientific research. And that's partly because we have a very open environment, a lot of international collaboration and sharing of ideas.
Right, but that openness can also be exploited by foreign entities
Right.
that are looking to gain access to our technology and innovations.
Right. And that's what this bill is trying to address. The THEPS Act was meant to boost Americans' semiconductor manufacturing and research, but there was some ambiguity in the original language about what exactly qualified as a, malign foreign talent recruitment program. And that was causing problems for universities and government agencies because they weren't sure how to apply the rules.
Right, and Representatives Miller and Lofgren, they both spoke about how this bill had bipartisan support and how the goal was to strike that balance, right, between maintaining our open scientific environment and making sure that we're protecting our national security.
Yeah, and the underlying concern was that that we don't want American taxpayer dollars to end up inadvertently supporting research that could benefit potential adversaries, especially when it comes to things like artificial intelligence or quantum computing.
Right. Those are some really high stakes areas of research.
Absolutely. And, the academic community itself, they had raised concerns about the lack of clarity in the initial definition. So this bill is trying to provide more specific guidance to help institutions navigate these really complex requirements.
Okay, so the House also discussed several other pieces of legislation that day. H.R. 1325, the Commercial Remote Sensing Amendment Act, that one focused on updating the reporting requirements for NOAA's office in this sector. Why should the learner care about this one?
Well, because commercial remote sensing, which uses satellites to capture imagery and data about the Earth, has become a really powerful tool across a lot of different areas. I mean, we're talking agriculture, finance, disaster preparedness, even national security.
Wow, so it's got its fingers in a lot of pies.
It does. And this bill, Representative Lucas, he explained that it's meant to give Congress a better understanding of how regulations are impacting this industry, which is growing really quickly. Technology is always advancing, so it's important to make sure that regulations keep pace without stifling innovation.
Right, that makes sense. It's about making sure that we're not holding back progress with outdated rules. Okay, next up was H.R. 1326, the DOE and USDA Interagency Research Act. And this one also got bipartisan support.
Right. And this one's all about fostering better collaboration between the Department of Energy and the Department of Agriculture, particularly when it comes to research and development.
Okay, so what kinds of things would they be working on together?
Well, the bill focuses on food, fiber, and fuel production, things like, improving energy efficiency in agriculture, developing sustainable bio-based fuels, that kind of thing.
So trying to leverage, I guess, the combined expertise of both agencies to, to achieve these goals that they both care about.
Yeah, exactly. And Representatives Lucas and Stevens, they both spoke about how this builds on previous efforts at collaboration and how the goal is to really maximize the return on taxpayer investment, by using those combined resources effectively.
Yeah, it sounds like a smart approach. Okay, and then the last big piece of legislation that the House discussed that day was H.R. 1534, the Impact Act, which stands for the Innovative Mitigation Partnerships for Asphalt and Concrete Technologies Act, which is a mouthful.
It is, but it's an important bill. We don't always think about it, but asphalt and concrete, they're essential for our infrastructure, right? Roads, bridges, buildings, all that stuff. And this bill is about trying to strengthen American manufacturing competitiveness by supporting innovation in how we produce those materials.
Okay, so how would it do that?
Well, the focus is on reducing carbon emissions and improving efficiency because, right now the production of cement, concrete, and asphalt, it's very energy intensive. And a lot of that production happens in other countries like China.
Right. So this is about bringing more of that manufacturing back to the U.S. and doing it in a way that's more sustainable.
Exactly. Representatives Miller and Fauci, they spoke about how this could boost American manufacturing, improve national security by reducing our reliance on foreign sources, and help us become better stewards of the environment.
It sounds like a really ambitious bill.
It is, but it's also really forward thinking. It's about recognizing that we can't keep doing things the way we've always done them. We
Yeah.
have to find ways to build and develop in a way that's both economically and environmentally sound.
Yeah, absolutely. So beyond these specific bills, what else did the House do that day?
Well, there were a bunch of, procedural things like appointing a speaker pro tempore who's basically like a temporary presiding officer and, taking recesses and formally expressing their condolences for Congressman Grijalva's passing.
Right.
They also had to agree on how to allocate funds for certain House committees, which is always a bit of a negotiation. And they introduced a whole bunch of new bills covering everything from Homeland Security accreditation to environmental reviews for broadband projects. And then there was even one instance where a member withdrew their co-sponsorship from a bill. So, just a whole mix of stuff that keeps the House running on a day-to-day basis.
Okay. So let's switch gears now and head over to the other side of Capitol Hill. What were the key things happening in the Senate that day?
Well, things kicked off with Senator Grassley reflecting on the peaceful transfer of power after the recent inauguration. Looking forward to working with President Trump and all that. He even mentioned the inaugural luncheon, which is, often seen as a moment of bipartisanship and civility.
Okay. And then what?
Well, then Senator Thune, the majority leader, he gave this kind of overview of what the Senate had been up to over the past 10 weeks, talking about how they had confirmed most of President Trump's cabinet nominees and made progress on border security and national defense spending and all that.
So setting the agenda for the coming weeks.
Exactly. And, he highlighted the speed with which they confirmed the cabinet, probably to contrast it with, how those confirmations went in previous administrations. And he really framed the Senate's agenda around President Trump's priorities, talking about things like tax relief and rolling back regulations.
Okay. And was there anything else that stood out to you from the Senate's activities?
Well, there was this one issue that came up that was, pretty concerning. A senator raised the alarm about reports that some senior U.S. leaders, including the vice president and the secretary of defense, had been discussing classified military operations, but they were doing it over an unsecure communication app.
Oh, wow. So a major national security risk.
Yeah, potentially huge. I mean, it raises all sorts of questions about how secure our sensitive information is, especially at the highest levels of government. And of course, it led to calls for a full investigation.
Yeah, I can see why. You can't be discussing troop movements and things like that over an app that's not secure.
Right. It just goes to show how, in this digital age, cybersecurity is more important than ever.
Absolutely. So the Senate also discussed Social Security that day, echoing some of the concerns that were raised in the House.
Yeah, there was a senator who was pretty critical of a new policy that limits people's ability to sign up for or comment on Social Security services over the phone.
Okay. And why was that?
Well, they felt like it was making it harder for people to access those services and that it was especially problematic for seniors who might not be as comfortable with technology. They also took issue with some comments that administration officials had made suggesting that, missed payments wouldn't be a big deal for most seniors.
Right. So again, we see those partisan divides emerging, right? Different views on how to approach the program and how to ensure its long-term viability.
Yeah, and the debate is only going to get more intense as time goes on, with the aging population and all that.
Absolutely. So Senator Cornyn of Texas also gave a report on his recent work period back in his home state.
Yeah, he talked about meeting with constituents and businesses and hearing a lot of praise for President Trump's agenda.
So keeping that connection with the folks back home.
Right, exactly. And he highlighted the importance of energy exports for Texas, and he talked about some specific infrastructure projects like the Corpus Christi Ship Channel Improvement Project. He also voiced strong support for extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which is, a key Republican priority.
Okay. And any mention of the national debt.
He did mention that, yeah. He talked about the need for fiscal responsibility, so trying to, balance those competing pressures.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so the Senate also paid tribute to the late Mia Love, a former congresswoman from Utah. Can you tell us a bit about her?
Yeah, she was a real trailblazer, the first Haitian American and the first Black Republican woman elected to Congress. And the senator who spoke about her really emphasized her dedication to the idea of American opportunity and her commitment to public service.
It sounds like she left a real legacy.
She did. And it's important to remember that Congress is made up of people from all walks of life and that their experiences shape the way they approach the issues.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's talk about some of the formal business that the Senate handled that day. They considered several nominations, right?
They did. Alexis Johnson was confirmed as the ambassador to the Republic of Côte d'Ivoire, and Veronica Wade-Dragseth was confirmed as the ambassador to the Republic of Palau.
Okay. And any other notable nominations?
Well, there's one that required a cloture vote, which means that, there was some debate and they had to take this procedural step to end that debate and move towards a final vote. That was for the nomination of Michael Kratsios to be the director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy.
So a bit more contentious than the other confirmations.
Right. And then there was one nomination that was actually withdrawn, that of Leo Brent Bozell III for a position at the U.S. Agency for Global Media.
And why is that?
It's hard to say for sure, but it probably means that the administration realized he wasn't going to get enough votes for confirmation.
Okay, so they decided to pull the plug before it went to a vote.
Exactly. And there were also notifications of proposed arms sales to Australia and Belgium, as well as an update on a previous arms sale to Saudi Arabia. So all pretty standard stuff when it comes to foreign policy and national security.
Right. And the Senate also took time to recognize some individuals for their contributions, right?
Yeah, they honored Candace McGraw, who is the retiring CEO of the Cincinnati Northern Kentucky International Airport, for her leadership in that role. And they recognized Mrs. Lois Frances Hodges Simons for her extensive community service in Maryland. And then finally, they paid tribute to Mark Sweeney for his nearly 40 years of service at the Library of Congress.
It's a good reminder, right, that there are so many people doing important work in all different fields.
Yeah, these tributes, they give us a glimpse into those different worlds, and they remind us that Congress is supposed to be representing all those different voices.
Yeah. There was also a message from President Trump that day, wasn't there?
There was, yeah. It was about the designation of certain appropriations as emergency spending. Basically, he was signaling that he disagreed with Congress about the emergency status of some of those funds.
So a potential point of friction between the branches.
Yeah, it happens from time to time. And then finally, just a bunch of procedural stuff, Committee reports being submitted, senators adding their names as co-sponsors to bills, the introduction of new resolutions, that kind of thing.
Right. Anything particularly interesting in those resolutions?
Well, there was one designating March 24th, 2025 as National Women of Color in Tech Day, which was meant to highlight the underrepresentation of women of color in STEM fields. And then another resolution expressing support for local public K-12 schools and condemning efforts to defund public education. And, one more designating March 15th as National Osceola Turkey Day, which not exactly sure what that's all about, but hey.
Well, there you go, the diversity of issues that Congress deals with.
Exactly.
Okay, so we also can't forget about the extensions of remarks section, right? Where individual members from both the House and the Senate can add their own statements and tributes.
Right. It's where they can really dive into those local stories and achievements that might not make it into the main part of the record.
So it's a good place to go if you want to get a sense of what's happening in different communities around the country.
It is. You might see a representative praising a local teacher for their dedication or a senator congratulating a small business on its anniversary. It's a way for them to, keep those connections strong.
Yeah, I like that. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the Congressional Record from March 24th, 2025. It's been a long journey.
It has, but we covered a lot of ground. We saw Congress honoring its own, debating some pretty significant legislation, grappling with big issues like national security and the future of Social Security. And we got a glimpse into the day-to-day workings of this complex institution.
Yeah, and for you, the learner, I hope this has been, a valuable look into how Congress functions and how the decisions they make impact our lives.
Absolutely. And we always encourage you to, go deeper, read the full congressional record yourself, follow the bills and the representatives that you care about. This deep dive was just a starting point. There's a whole world of information out there just waiting to be explored.
So keep learning, keep asking questions, and we'll see you next time on Congress in Context.